My name is Lily Spencer. I am 33 years old, and on the night that 7 members of my family sat in my mother's living room waiting for me to admit that I had wasted my 20s, the doorbell rang and a mailman stood on the porch with 9 bags of letters from a town I had spent 37 hours in and never expected to hear from again. My mother had set down her tea and looked at me the way she always looked at me when she had already decided something but wanted me to arrive at it on my own. She said, "Lily, Caroline has a home. Diana is finishing her master's degree." She paused. She let the sentence end there. Everyone in the room understood what came after the pause. I had understood it for a decade. My Uncle Frank was in the corner with a beer he wasn't drinking. My sister Caroline sat against her husband Marcus on the beige sofa my mother had owned since before I was born. My younger sister Diana was tapping one fingernail against the arm of her chair, which is what she does when she has something prepared and is waiting for the right moment to say it. And my Aunt Jessica, sitting beside Frank, was looking directly at me with the expression I had learned to read over many years. It is the expression of someone who is about to watch something they cannot stop and have no place in when it happens. I was deciding what to say when the doorbell rang. Nobody moved. My mother's house does not get visitors at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. The bell rang a second time. My mother looked at me. She said, "Go see who it is." That was how she did everything. Quiet, certain, impossible to argue with. I stood up. My lower back lit up the way it always does when I've been sitting still too long. A deep grinding ache from the old injury I got 3 years ago during a flood response in the western part of the state. A fall I took on a muddy slope at 4 in the morning that I never quite healed from. I walked to the front door and opened it. The man standing on the porch was the regular carrier for this zip code. I had seen him enough times to recognize him. He was somewhere around 55, in his postal uniform, with the look of someone who had been on his feet since before sunrise and had one last thing left to do. Behind him, parked against the curb, was a small, white postal van. In his hands was a canvas bag, stuffed so full that the drawstring at the top was pulled taut. He said, "Miss Spencer? I'm sorry for the hour. We weren't sure how to handle these. They all came addressed to your name at this address." I looked at the bag. I looked back at him. He said, "There are 8 more in the truck." I said, "What are they?" He opened the top of the bag. They were letters. Hundreds of letters. Every single one in a handwritten envelope. Every single one with the same return address printed in the upper left corner. Millhaven, Tennessee, Millhaven. The name made me put my hand on the door frame. 37 hours. That was how long I had been in Millhaven 11 months earlier, the night the Elmore River breached its banks and pushed through the lower district of the town, like something that had been patient for a very long time and had finally decided it was done waiting. 37 hours without sleep, without sitting down, without stopping, and then I had driven 4 hours home, lying flat across the back seat of my car because my back would not let me sit upright, staring at the ceiling of my car, listening to the radio say things I could not absorb. I had not expected to hear from Millhaven again, not because I wanted to forget it, because that is the nature of the work. You arrive, you do what the situation requires, and you leave. The town continues, you continue, nobody checks on each other afterward, or so I had believed. My mother called from inside the house. She said, "Lily, who is it?" I didn't answer. I looked at the carrier and said, "How many total?" He said, "We counted 317. 317. I said, "Can you help me bring them inside?" He said, "Of course. I want to tell you about Millhaven now. I want to tell you about all 317 letters, about the people who sat down and wrote them, about what I read that night and in the weeks that followed. But first I need to tell you about the chair in my mother's living room, because that is where this story actually begins. Not that Friday night, not the moment the postal van parked outside. It begins years earlier, on the afternoon I was 23 years old and called my mother to tell her I had accepted a job. I had just graduated. I had a degree in emergency management from a state university that nobody outside the field had heard of, and I had been offered a junior coordination position at a nonprofit called the Relief Coordination Network, which people in the work called RCN, which specialized in large-scale disaster response when local resources were overwhelmed. The pay was modest. The work was heavy. It was exactly what I had wanted since I was 19 years old and spent a summer helping with flood cleanup in a rural county and understood for the first time that most of the chaos that follows a disaster is not inevitable. It is the result of no one having organized it. My mother was quiet for 4 seconds when I told her. I counted because I was nervous, and counting is what I do when I'm nervous. After 4 seconds, she said, "How much does it pay?" I told her. She said, "Is that enough to live on?" I said, "Yes." She said, "But why that kind of work?" I said, "Because it's what I want to do, Mom." That was the wrong answer. Not wrong in any logical or moral sense. Wrong in the way that true answers are sometimes wrong when said to people who don't have a frame to hold them. My mother, Helena Spencer, was born in this city, grew up in this city, worked as an accountant in this city for 35 years, and retired with a paid-off house and a savings account that did not require her to worry. Her measure of a good life was stability. Her measure of a good job was one you could explain in a single sentence and the person you were explaining it to would nod. A real job, in her language, meant a job where something accumulated, a pension, a title, a plan you could point to. What I did not speak that language. I am a disaster relief coordinator. When floods hit a river town or wildfires force a county to evacuate or a factory explosion overwhelms a small city's emergency services, RCN gets called in. My job is to stand in the middle of everything and make it less chaotic. I coordinate between local government and volunteer organizations. I manage the gap between available resources and the people who need them. I do this while running on 3 hours of sleep in borrowed rain gear, making decisions in 15-minute windows, with incomplete information, in places I have never been before and may never see again. Nobody ever called it charity work to my face using exactly those words. They found other ways. "Are you doing volunteer stuff?" was the first version when I was just starting out. "Does that organization actually pay you?" was the second version 2 years in when I still had not bought a house. "When are you going to get a real job?" was the third version, which started arriving around the time I turned 30. "Don't you feel like you're wasting your potential?" was the fourth version. And that was the version I was sitting with in my mother's living room on that Friday evening when the doorbell rang. To understand why that Friday had the weight it did, you need to understand what had built up over the years before it. The first Thanksgiving after I started at RCN, I came home 3 days late from a flood response because the roads out had been washed out and I couldn't leave until they reopened. I arrived at my mother's house after the holiday was over. She opened the door, and the first thing she said was, "Where have you been? You could have called." I said I was working. I said the roads were closed. I said I was sorry. She said, "Don't they have enough people that it doesn't have to be you every single time?" The honest answer was that, in that particular response, during those 3 days, it had essentially been me and one colleague coordinating food and supply distribution for about 2,300 people who couldn't leave the area. But I had learned by then that the honest answer to questions like that, one, did not create understanding. It created more questions about why my organization wasn't better funded and whether I was being taken advantage of, which was never the point. So I sat down and ate leftover turkey and said I was tired, and she said I looked thin, and that was the end of it. That was the first of many dinners I would sit through over the years, listening to questions about stability and savings and when I was going to make some decisions, and answering in short sentences because I had learned that longer ones didn't land where I meant them to. When I was 26, I coordinated a wildfire evacuation response in the northern part of the state. More than 500 households displaced, a temporary shelter camp established within 18 hours. My job to make sure the people coming in knew where to go and had what they needed when they got there. I slept 4 hours in the first 3 days. Not a number I'm proud of, just the number. When I came home, my mother looked at me and said, "You look tired. You've lost weight again." I said I was fine. I said it had been a busy few weeks. She said, "Working all those extra hours with no overtime pay, I don't understand it." She said it without any cruelty. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, as a statement of logic that she assumed I would eventually recognize as true. And the thing was, she wasn't trying to dismiss what I had done. She simply had no vocabulary for it. The thing I had spent those 3 days building, the thing I had not slept for, didn't exist in the language she had for measuring whether something had been worth it. That gap between us was not born from cruelty. It was born from the fact that we had grown up with completely different understandings of what value meant, and neither of us had figured out how to translate. The year I turned 29, there was a moment I still think about. I was coordinating a supply distribution at a flood relief site. A family of 6 was on the intake list. Father with a broken leg from the evacuation, mother 7 months pregnant, 4 kids between 3 and 9. They were in tent 17 at the temporary camp. I went to tent 17 at 10 o'clock at night to check whether they had the medical supplies they needed. The mother was giving the youngest one medicine when I came in. She looked up at me with a look that wasn't quite a thank you and wasn't quite a question. It was something quieter. The look of someone who had been managing too much for too long and had arrived at a kind of stripped-down steadiness. I can't describe that look to my mother in a way that would translate into the language she uses for measuring things. I can't put it in a salary figure or a career trajectory. It existed in tent 17 at 10 at night, and then I moved on to the next tent, and then the next. But it stayed in me. The things that happen in those moments always stay, even when you don't have words for where to put them. The year I was 31, my sister Caroline got married. The wedding was at a small hotel, nice enough to satisfy my mother, intimate enough that no one felt lost. I was a bridesmaid. I had adjusted my work schedule to be there on time, which took 2 calls and a favor. I wore the sage green dress Caroline had chosen for the whole wedding party, stood in the right place for photographs, smiled at the right moments. At the reception dinner, I was seated at table 4 next to a woman named Mrs. Whitfield, a friend of the family of Caroline's husband, the kind of woman who asks polite questions at other people's events and moves on after the answer. She turned to me and said, "And what do you do?" Before I could open my mouth, my mother, seated 2 chairs away, said, "Lily does social work, relief work, something like that. She travels a lot." Mrs. Whitfield said, "Oh, how nice." And the conversation moved on. I looked at my mother. She wasn't looking at me. She was already talking to the person on her other side, smiling, completely at ease, having described her daughter's career in the way that felt most accurate to her. Relief work, something like that. She travels a lot. 10 years. I had been doing this work for 10 years, and that was how my mother explained it to a stranger at her daughter's wedding. Not because she wanted to minimize it, because that was genuinely everything she knew how to say about it, filtered through the only framework she had. I drank the rest of my wine and ordered another glass. That night, I called Sophie Tran. Sophie was my colleague at RCN, had been there 8 years. The only person I knew at work who understood that sometimes you needed to call someone at 11 at night not to talk about logistics, but just to have someone on the other end of the line. Sophie picked up after 2 rings and said, "Family?" I said, "Relief work." Something like that. She travels a lot. Sophie was quiet for 1 second. Then she said, "Ignore it." I said, "I can't ignore it." She said, "I know, but that's the only advice I've got right now." That was what I valued most about Sophie. She didn't pretend to have answers when she didn't. Now I need to tell you about Millhaven, because that is where the weight of this story actually lives. Millhaven is a small town in eastern Tennessee, population around 8,000, situated along the valley of the Elmore River. It is the kind of town that people describe as quiet until the land decides otherwise. The Weather Service had issued warnings 3 days out. A low-pressure system had shifted course unexpectedly. Rain totals were running well above the forecast. The ground in the region had been saturated for 2 weeks before the storm even arrived. But the river doesn't telegraph exactly when it's going to go. It never does. I got the call at 2:17 in the morning on a Wednesday. Not from Millhaven directly, from the State Regional Coordination Office. The man on the other end was David Park, the regional director, and his voice had the particular steadiness of someone who had been through enough of these situations to know that panic doesn't help the math. David said, "Lily, the Elmore is rising faster than the models predicted. Millhaven's lower district has over 3,000 residents. Their local response team is understaffed, and the mayor's office is requesting outside coordination. Can you go?" I was lying on my back in bed, my lower back doing what it does at 2 in the morning, that deep ache along the lumbar that never fully went away after the fall 3 years back. I stared at the ceiling. I said, "How much lead time do I have?" David said, "Current estimates put peak water at 8 to 12 hours from now. Sooner is better." I said, "I'll be on the road in 20 minutes. I was on the road in 18. I know because I counted. Not to prove anything, just because timing matters in this work, in a way that becomes reflexive after enough years of it. My go bag lived behind the front door of my apartment. 10 years had taught me that 2 in the morning phone calls don't wait for you to organize. Rain gear, flashlight, basic first aid kit, 2 changes of dry clothes, backup battery packs, printed maps of the region I had pulled from the network the moment David called. Printed, not digital, because screens fail in water and paper doesn't. I drove 4 hours in heavy rain, not light rain, the kind that makes your wipers work at full speed and still leaves you squinting. I listened to weather updates and river level reports on the radio the whole way. The Elmore was rising faster with each update. When I parked outside the Millhaven Municipal Building, I sat in my car for 1 extra minute before getting out. Not because I was scared, because my back needed that minute to decide it was going to cooperate for the next however many hours this was going to take. Mayor David McCormick was standing at the entrance of the municipal building. He was around 60, salt and pepper hair, wearing his official jacket with a wet patch across the shoulder where he'd been standing in the rain, eyes that clearly hadn't closed since the previous night. He looked at me when I got out of the car and said, "Miss Spencer, thank you for coming. We're in rough shape here." I said, "Let me see the map." The official evacuation map of Millhaven's lower district was spread out on the table in the mayor's conference room. The flood zone was shaded in red. Evacuation corridors were marked. Assembly points were noted. It looked comprehensive. I looked at the map and said, "What's your list of residents in the flood zone without personal vehicles?" The mayor said, "We're still compiling that." I said, "How long will that take?" He said, "By morning, maybe." I said, "We don't have until morning. I need your social services intake lists. Elderly residents living alone, residents with mobility limitations, low-income households flagged for any kind of support. I need it now." He looked at me for exactly 1 second and then told his aide to pull the files. I had been doing this long enough to know that official maps are starting points, not endpoints. A map tells you geography. It doesn't tell you about the 91-year-old woman living alone in a house that isn't in any database because she never signed up for anything. It doesn't tell you about the man in a wheelchair waiting for his brother who isn't coming. It doesn't tell you about the family that moved in 2 months ago and hasn't registered their address yet. The distance between the map and those people is where deaths happen in floods like this one. I had learned that at 25 years old during my second major evacuation response, when 2 elderly residents were not moved out in time because they weren't on any list. They survived but were stranded for 2 days before anyone found them. I didn't sleep well for a while after that. And after that, I worked by a different rule. The map is where you start, not where you stop. Tommy Rawlings showed up at 2:50 in the morning. He was 26, wearing his fire department shirt, even though his shift had ended 3 hours earlier. He came into the coordination room, looked around, and said, "Who's running the evacuation?" I raised my hand. He said, "I know the lower district. I grew up there. Let me help." I looked at him. Tommy had the look of someone who, when they say they know a place, they mean it in the way you can only mean it when you actually grew up there. When you know which houses have dogs that bark and which ones are quiet, which road floods from the east side first, which neighbor will be hardest to convince to leave. I said, "You're with me." It was the right decision. We started at the southern end of the lower district and went house by house. Me, Tommy, and 3 local volunteers the mayor had assembled. The rain was steady and hard. Water on the roadways was already at ankle height when we started. My estimate was that we had maybe 6 hours, possibly fewer if the rain kept up at the current rate. We found Eleanor Gibbs at 4:32 in the morning. Number 16, Harper Street. A white wooden house that had gone the color of old bone, with a sheet of corrugated tin patched over a spot on the roof that someone had meant to fix properly and never gotten around to. She was 91 years old and had lived there since 1981 when her husband passed. She wasn't on any emergency contact list because she had never filled one out. She had no cell phone. She had not heard the warning sirens because she had been partially deaf for years, and the siren placement in the lower district was not designed with her in mind. Tommy knew about her because when he was a boy, he used to borrow books from her front porch library. He knocked on her door and called out, "Mrs. Gibbs, Mrs. Gibbs, it's Tommy Rawlings." A light came on in the back of the house. Slow footsteps. The door opened. Eleanor Gibbs was making tea in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning with no knowledge that the water outside was already creeping up the road. She looked at Tommy and said, "Tommy Rawlings, I wondered if you'd moved away." Tommy said, "No, ma'am. We need to go right now. The river's coming." She looked past him at the water in the street. She looked back at Tommy. She said, "Let me get my coat." 30 seconds. She had her coat and she was stepping out the door. That is the moment I think about most in this work. The moment when a 91-year-old woman walks out of her house in the dark and the rain and trusts the people at her door. She had no reason to trust us other than that Tommy knew her name and the water was on the road. She didn't ask for paperwork. She didn't ask for credentials. She got her coat and she came out. The Wynn family lived at number 12 Riverview Drive, second floor of a small apartment building. Tommy knew them because their father worked at the same plant as his cousin. We knocked at 5:12 in the morning. The woman who opened the door was Hoa, 31 or 32 years old, short hair, still in her sleep clothes, holding a child about 18 months old against her chest. In the back room, a little girl of maybe 4 was asleep on a mattress on the floor. Hoa looked at me and said something in Vietnamese. I understood enough to know she was asking a question, but not enough to answer it properly. I pulled out my phone and called Sophie. Sophie picked up after 2 rings. I said, "Sophie, I need you to speak to someone in Vietnamese. Right now. It's urgent." Sophie didn't ask anything. She said, "Put her on." I handed the phone to Hoa. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. I watched Hoa's face move through whatever Sophie was saying. At the end, Hoa looked at me and nodded and went into the back room. 15 minutes later, she came out with the baby on her hip and the little girl, Lon, awake and holding a small stuffed rabbit. Lan was 4 years old, with sleep still in her eyes, and she was very calm in the way that small children sometimes are in the middle of crisis when the adults around them haven't panicked. We got them onto the evacuation bus. When the bus pulled away, I saw Hoa through the window looking back. I don't know what she was looking at. Maybe the apartment, maybe the street, maybe something that only she could see. We found Robert Cahill at 6:20 in the morning. He was 38 years old, lived alone on the ground floor of Harrison Apartments, on the east side of the lower district, right on the riverbank. In the official evacuation registry, he was marked as self-evacuating, with a notation that his brother would come for him. His brother had not come. Tommy knew which unit was his. We knocked. No answer. Tommy knocked harder. The door opened. Robert Cahill was sitting in his wheelchair beside the window. His phone was in his hand. The water outside was level with the bottom of the windowsill. He looked up at us and said, "I called my brother 21 times. I said, "We're here now. We need to move." He didn't ask questions. He didn't explain anything. Tommy and I moved his chair toward the door. I called for additional support on the radio. By the time we got to the entrance, 2 more volunteers were there. They lifted the chair over the water pooled at the threshold. When we had him on the bus, Robert looked back at me and said, "I was starting to think nobody was coming." Tommy said, "We came." That was all that needed to be said. The floodwater reached the lower district at 7:42 in the morning. We completed evacuation of the lower district at 7:15 in the morning. 27 minutes. That was the margin. Total residents evacuated from Millhaven's lower district, 847. No one died. No one was trapped. I remember checking my watch when the last confirmation came in. I was standing on the high ground above the municipal building with Tommy, looking down at the lower district as the water started taking the roads we had just driven through. Mayor McCormick was behind us. He said, "Everyone out?" I said, "Everyone out." He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment and didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Tommy said quietly, "That was close." I said, "Yeah." And then I sat down on the pavement right where I was standing because my back had reached its limit and I was not going to be upright for another few minutes no matter what. I sat on the wet concrete and looked down at the flooding roads and didn't speak for a while. Tommy sat down beside me. He didn't speak either. Sometimes the silence next to another person is the only appropriate thing after something large has passed through. I didn't tell my mother about any of this when I got home, not because I was hiding it, but because when I called her from the road, still 4 hours from home, my back in enough pain that I was driving at 60 instead of 70, she said, "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you." And I said, "I was working. The phones were overwhelmed." And she said, When are you going to learn to give people a heads up before you disappear? There was no room in that conversation for Eleanor Gibbs and her coat. There was no room for Hoa and Lon. There was no room for Robert Cahill and 21 unanswered calls. It didn't fit. I had tried to make it fit many times over 10 years. I had sat across from my mother at her kitchen table and told her about the work, tried to give her what I thought were the right stories to help her understand. And what I got back was never hostility. It was logic. It was, does your organization reimburse you for the extra driving? It was, are you sure you're not taking on more than me's good for you? It was the language of someone who cared about me but had no vocabulary for what I was caring about. So I stopped telling the stories. Not all at once, gradually. The way you stop doing something when you've learned that it doesn't produce what you hoped it would. The family meeting on that Friday was not spontaneous. Caroline called me 2 days before and said, Lily, come to Mom's on Friday for dinner. She wants to talk. I said, talk about what? Caroline paused before she said, just family stuff. She's worried about you. I knew what that meant, but I came anyway, because that was my mother's house and that was the table I grew up at, and because no matter what 10 years had looked like, I was still holding on to the possibility that it could go differently. That might have been the most stubborn thing about me in all those years. Not the job, not the choices, the hope that I carried in despite every reasonable piece of evidence I had collected against it. When I sat down that Friday, the room had a prepared quality to it. Uncle Frank in the corner, Aunt Jessica watching with that look of hers, Diana with her fingernail tapping, Caroline pressed against Marcus, my mother with her tea. This was not a casual dinner. It had been arranged. My mother said, Lily, I want to have a direct conversation with you. I said, all right. She said, you're 33 years old. I said, I know. She said, Caroline is settled. Diana is nearly finished with her program. She let the next part hang. I said, what is it you're asking me to say? She said, I'm asking you to acknowledge that the path you're on doesn't add up to anything sustainable. You don't have savings. You don't have property. You've spent your best years running around for other people and you have nothing to show for it. Diana leaned forward and said, Lily, nobody's saying the work isn't good. We're just saying, what happens to you? In 15 years, what does your life look like? I said, I'm not sure I can predict 15 years. Diana said, that's exactly the problem. My mother said, Lily, I want you to admit that you haven't been thinking about your future. The doorbell rang. I have told this next part many times in the months since. The 9 bags of letters in the living room, the way my mother looked at them, the way Diana immediately asked where they were from. But what I haven't told many people is what happened inside me in the 10 seconds between opening the door and seeing what was in the bag. I thought about Eleanor Gibbs making tea. I thought about Lan asleep on her mattress, holding her rabbit. I thought about Robert Cahill holding his phone with the screen still lit from his 21st call. I thought about the 27 minutes, and I thought about my mother, 15 feet away in the living room, asking me to admit that none of it had added up to anything. I asked the carrier if he could help bring them in. He said, of course. 9 canvas bags arranged in the center of my mother's living room floor were not a dramatic thing to look at. They were just bags. But they were there, solid and undeniable, in the exact room where 5 minutes earlier, I had been asked to account for 10 years. My mother said, what on earth is all this? I said, letters. Frank stood up from his corner and walked over and looked into the open top of one of the bags. He looked at me. He said, from where? I said, Millhaven, Tennessee. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. I sat down on the floor. Not as a statement, just because my back was done and there was no other surface that made sense. I opened the nearest bag and pulled out the top envelope. White envelope, blue ink, neat handwriting. Return address. Thomas and Mary Hendricks, 14 Maple Street, Millhaven, Tennessee. I opened it. The letter from Thomas and Mary Hendricks began, Miss Spencer, we're writing this because we don't know any other way to say what we want to say, and because things that matter don't deserve to stay unsaid. I read silently for a moment. Everyone in the room was watching me. I started reading out loud. Thomas and Mary Hendricks, 52 and 49, had lived at 14 Maple Street for 21 years. Mary was in the middle of her 4th round of chemotherapy for breast cancer, and the treatment had left her unable to walk steadily. The night the Elmore breached its banks, Thomas had called 23 emergency numbers and reached no one. He had begun to think they were going to handle it alone. Then someone knocked on their door. Thomas wrote, "She didn't ask us whether we were registered or whether we qualified for assistance or whether we were on any list. She asked us what we needed help with." She stayed until Mary was on the bus, and even then she stood outside the door of the bus until it closed. Mary had written below in a smaller hand, the handwriting of someone who was not at full strength. I remember her hair was soaked completely through from the rain. She didn't stop to cover it or dry it off. She was too busy making sure I was warm enough. I've thought about that many times since. Somebody making sure you're warm before they think about themselves. I don't forget things like that. I stopped reading. The room was completely quiet. I don't remember Thomas and Mary by name, not because they didn't matter, because in those 37 hours, I encountered hundreds of people, and my memory works the way the job works. You hold what you need to act on next, and you keep moving. But the wet hair Mary described came back to me when I read her words. Came back like something that had never fully left, like a detail that had been waiting in a room I hadn't opened. My mother sat without moving. She was looking at her own hands. I took out the second envelope, yellow, with the uneven writing of a child. Return address. 3rd grade, Class B. Millhaven Elementary School. Inside was a folded sheet of wide-ruled paper, decorated along the margins with crayon drawings of houses and suns and trees. In the center of the page, in red, capital letters, "Thank you, Ms. Lily." Below it were 19 lines, each one from a different student, each in different handwriting. Line 1, "My name is Emma, and I want to say thank you because that night I lost my stuffed elephant, but you and the other man helped me and my mom get out safe. My mom says we were lucky there were people like you." Line 4, "My name is Michael Thompson. My dad says if there hadn't been someone coordinating that night, our house wouldn't have made it out in time. I want to grow up and help people the way you do." Line 9, "My name is Aisha Williams. I was really scared that night, but the woman who came to our house told me everything was going to be okay. I didn't know her name until my teacher told our class about the evacuation later. Her name is Lily." I wrote that down. I did not read all 19 lines out loud. I stopped at the 9th. Caroline spoke for the first time since the bags had come in. She said, "Lily." I didn't look up. Diana said quietly, "I didn't know." I didn't say anything. The 17th letter I opened that night was from Robert Cahill. I recognized the name the moment I saw it on the envelope. He had written 4 pages by hand, the letters careful and even in a way that suggested he had taken his time. I didn't read all of it out loud. Some things are not meant to be read out loud in someone's living room on a Friday. Some things need to be read in private, slowly, so you can let them land without an audience watching your face. But I read the last paragraph. Robert wrote, "Miss Spencer, I sat in that wheelchair by that window and called my brother 21 times. The water was level with the bottom of the window. I had started running calculations in my head that I didn't want to be running. And then someone knocked. I didn't know your name then. I just saw a woman with soaking wet hair and a yellow rain jacket and the younger guy beside her. And before I could say a word, you said, 'We have to go right now.' You didn't ask if I could transfer out of the chair on my own. You didn't explain any process. You just turned to the guy next to you and said, 'Help me with this.' And he did, and we went. I want to tell you that the moment that door opened changed something in me. Not in the way it happens in movies, in the real way. The kind of change you can't explain to anyone, but you carry it with you in how you see ordinary days afterward and understand that they're not ordinary at all." I folded the letter. Uncle Frank, who had not spoken since the bags came in, stood up and walked into the kitchen. After a few seconds, I heard the faucet run. I kept opening letters. A letter from a nurse named Linda Park, who had worked the intake station at the temporary shelter that night. She wrote that the evacuees kept mentioning the woman who had coordinated the district sweep and that she had asked enough people that she finally got a name. Lily Spencer, RCN. She wrote, "I put that name in my notes the night you came in to drop off the last transport confirmation because I wanted to remember it." A letter from Tom and Susan Gallagher, an older couple who had initially refused to leave because they didn't want to abandon their dog, Biscuit, a 12-year-old retriever who couldn't move fast. I had gone back to their house a second time and told them the dog could come. I wasn't entirely sure that was within the official parameters, but I was sure that I couldn't leave two elderly people in a flooding house over a 12-year-old dog. Susan Gallagher wrote, Biscuit passed in February of this year from old age, but he went in our own home, on his own bed, with us beside him. You didn't make us choose between ourselves and him. I don't know if that was the rule or if you just decided it was the right thing. I suppose it doesn't matter. What matters is that it was the kindest thing anyone has done for us in a very long time. And the kindest things are always the ones you remember longest. I don't know why the letter about Biscuit was the one that made me stop and sit for a while. Maybe it was Susan Gallagher and the way she wrote about kindness. Not heroism, not sacrifice, just kindness. The smallest word for the largest category. Diana stood up without saying anything, went out of the room, and came back with a box of tissues from the bathroom. She set it on the floor beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't explain. That was the first thing my younger sister had done all evening that didn't require a word. The 28th letter I opened was from Mayor David McCormick. It was written on official Millhaven municipal stationery, signed and stamped. He wrote, Miss Spencer, on behalf of the town of Millhaven, I am pleased to inform you that the City Council voted unanimously on the 15th of February to name our new community green space Spencer Park, in recognition of your coordination work and that of your team on the night of November 12th. The Council also wishes to extend to you an invitation to receive honorary citizenship of Millhaven at the dedication ceremony, scheduled for the morning of Saturday, March 12th. We would be honored to have you return to Millhaven for the occasion. I read that paragraph. I set the letter down. I read it again. Spencer Park. Caroline said my name very quietly. I didn't have an answer ready. A letter from Maggie Thompson, the principal of Millhaven Elementary School, written on school letterhead. She wrote that 83 students enrolled at her school had lived in the lower district. All 83 had been successfully evacuated the night of November 12th. She wrote that she had checked that number the morning after, and the morning after that, and several times since. 83 out of 83. She wrote, every time I check that number, I think about the people who made it possible. The children went home to their parents. All of them. I folded the letter. My mother said something. She said it the way she doesn't usually say things, without the careful steadiness she normally keeps in her voice. She said, 83 children. I looked up. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in a long time, or maybe had seen but stopped recognizing at some point. It was the look of someone who was in the middle of understanding something new, not performing understanding, actually arriving at it. I opened more letters. Not all of them that night, but more than I expected to. A letter from a woman named Karen Okonkwo, a third-grade teacher at the elementary school. She had asked her students to write about what they remembered from that night, and 9 of her 24 students had written about the woman who knocked on their door. She wrote that the children didn't have many specific details, but they remembered a feeling. She wrote, they said that when she came, they were less scared. Not because she said reassuring things, because she didn't stand there discussing the situation. She just started doing something. I've been teaching for 21 years, and I believe that is the most important lesson adults can teach children. That when things get bad, there are people who show up. I heard something in the room shift. Caroline made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. I opened the 83rd letter that night because I recognized the name on the envelope, Hoa Nguyen. Hoa had written in Vietnamese. Beside each line in her letter was a handwritten English translation in a different hand from someone who had helped her. She wrote, Miss Lily, I am Hoa. We lived at 12 Riverview Drive. That night you called someone to speak Vietnamese with me. I had only been in the country for 3 months, and my English was not good enough. I understood that you were there to help me and my daughters. My little one, Lan, was sleeping. I did not want to wake her because she had only just stopped crying. You did not rush me. You waited. I am grateful for that. Lan is 5 years old now, and she is in kindergarten at the elementary school, 10 minutes walk from our apartment. Every morning I walk her to school. Every morning I think about you. I read the last line twice. Every morning I walk her to school. Every morning I think about you. The room was quiet. My mother looked at me, and she said something in a voice that was not her usual voice, not the voice she used when she had a point to make or a worry to express. She said it simply, the way you say something when all you want is to actually hear the answer. She said, Lily, tell me about that night. All of it. I looked at her for a moment. Then I started talking. I told her about the call at 2:17 in the morning. I told her about driving 4 hours in rain, so heavy I could barely see the road. I told her about David Park's voice and about packing in 18 minutes and about the go bag behind my door that had been there for 10 years, because that was just how I lived now. I told her about David McCormick standing outside the building with his jacket wet at the shoulder. I told her about the map and the gap between the map and the people. I told her about Tommy Rawlings saying I grew up there and how I had decided to trust him in about 3 seconds. I told her about Eleanor Gibbs making tea at 4:30 in the morning. I told her about the 30 seconds it took for a 91-year-old woman to get her coat and walk out her front door in the rain. I told her about calling Sophie so Sophie could talk to Hoa. I told her about Lan asleep on the mattress and the stuffed rabbit and the way Hoa had waited for Sophie to explain before she nodded and went to wake the child. I told her about Robert Cahill and the 21 calls and the water at the window and the way Tommy and I had moved without discussing it, without assigning tasks, without any of the things you're supposed to document. I told her about 7:42 in the morning and 7:15 in the morning and the 27 minutes between them. I told her about sitting down on the wet pavement at the top of the hill because my back had reached its end, and Tommy sitting down beside me, and neither of us saying anything for a few minutes. I told her everything I had not found a way to tell her in 10 years. Not because I had decided to, exactly, because she had asked. She had asked in a way I hadn't heard from her before, with the asking directed at the answer and not at whatever came after the answer. Nobody interrupted me. When I stopped, the room was different. Not because the people in it had changed, because the thing that had been sitting between us for so long, the thing none of us had known how to look at directly, had finally been put on the table. And once something is on the table, it's harder to talk around. Caroline said, I didn't know. I said, I know. She said, no, Lily. I mean, I genuinely didn't know. Nobody told me these things. I looked at my sister. I said, I think I didn't know how to tell them. It was the first time I had said that out loud. My mother didn't hug me that night. She didn't make a speech. That wasn't how Helena Spencer operated, and I had known that for long enough that I wasn't waiting for it. But before I left, she stood up and went into the kitchen. When she came back, she was carrying a tin, ginger snaps. She only made ginger snaps on occasions when she wanted to say something she didn't have words for, and she had been making them that way since I was a child. She put the tin in my hands and said, drive carefully going home. That was what she said. Nothing more. But I had known my mother long enough to understand that for Helena Spencer, that sentence was carrying a great deal. I drove home that night with the tin of ginger snaps on the passenger seat and 9 bags of letters in the back of my car. My back ached the way it always did after a long day. I didn't know what would change or how much. I just drove. I called Sophie when I was on the highway. She picked up and said, what happened? I said, Millhaven sent me 317 letters. A longer silence than usual. Sophie said, you're serious. I said, completely serious. She said, I don't know what to say to that. I said, I don't either. We were quiet for a while, listening to the road. Then Sophie said, are you okay? I thought about the question for a moment. My back hurt. It had been a long evening. I didn't know what the next weeks would look like, but on the passenger seat was a tin of ginger snaps from my mother, and in the back of the car were 317 letters from people I had met in the middle of the worst night many of them had lived through. I said, yeah, I'm okay. She said, good. That was all we needed. I went to Millhaven in March. The dedication of Spencer Park was on a Saturday morning, with the kind of thin winter sun that doesn't warm you much but makes the air very clear. Sophie came with me. She had pointed out that she was not technically invited, and I had pointed out that I was inviting her now, and that had settled it. Mayor McCormick was at the park entrance. He shook my hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake and said, thank you for coming back. Tommy Rawlings was in the front row in his department shirt, grinning when he saw me. He said, I told everyone you'd show up. I said, how were you so sure? He said, I know you by now. Eleanor Gibbs was there with a walker, wearing a purple coat that she had clearly chosen specifically for the occasion. She was 92 and stood straighter than the night I'd first seen her. When she spotted me, she said, "There she is," and took my hand and did not let go for the duration of the mayor's remarks. Her hand was small and light. I couldn't remember the last time someone had held my hand during a public ceremony. Robert Cahill arrived in a newer electric wheelchair than the one I remembered. He looked at me and said straightforwardly, "Did you read my letter?" I said, "I read every word." He nodded. He said, "Good. That was everything we needed to say." Hoa and Lan were there. Lan wore a red coat and stood next to her mother with the patience of a 5-year-old who didn't entirely understand why so many adults were standing around talking but understood that this was a moment to stand still. When Lan noticed me, she asked her mother something quietly. Hoa nodded. Lan looked up at me and said, "You're Miss Lily?" I said, "That's me." She said, "My mom talks about you." I looked at Hoa. Hoa was looking away with the expression of someone who has decided not to cry in a public setting and is succeeding at some cost. I understood that feeling very well. Mayor McCormick's remarks lasted about 12 minutes. I took in parts of it and let other parts go because I kept getting distracted by the people in the crowd. Linda Park was standing with a man I assumed was her husband. Maggie Thompson was grouped with several teachers from the school. Tom Gallagher made his way over to me after the ceremony and said, "Miss Spencer, do you remember me?" I thought of the letter. I said, "You're Biscuit's dad." He laughed, and in the laugh there was something both sad and easy. He said, "That's right, I am. Susan's at home today. Bad knee, but she wanted me to thank you in person." When the ceremony ended and people began to drift away, I stood in the middle of Spencer Park and looked around at it. It wasn't large. A few wooden benches, some young trees that would take years to give any real shade, a stone path looping through the grass, a modest sign at the entrance, "Spencer Park, dedicated March." Sophie came and stood next to me. She looked at the sign and then at me. She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Strange." She said, "Strange how?" I said, "I didn't do the work to end up with a sign. I did it because there were people who needed it, and now there's a sign, and I'm not sure where to stand in relation to that." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Just stand where you are. Your name on that sign doesn't change who you were when you weren't thinking about a sign." I looked at my friend. She was right. She usually was, in the particular way she had of being right without making anything out of it. My mother called that evening while Sophie and I were driving back. She said, "How was it today?" I said, "Really good. A lot of people came." She said, "Did the mayor speak?" I said, "He did. It was very kind." A silence. Then my mother said something she doesn't say often. She said, "Lily, I'm not good at saying these things. You know that." I said, "I know." She said, "But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago." I sat with that for about 10 seconds. 10 years. I had been waiting a long time to hear that. And now that it was here, it didn't arrive the way I had imagined it arriving, with music or revelation or something coming loose in the air between us. It was just my mother's voice, quiet in my ear, saying a sentence she had not known how to say before now, which was, in the end, more true than any version I had imagined. I said, "Thank you, Mom." Sophie, sitting in the passenger seat, kept her eyes on the road and said nothing. She knew when to give a person a minute. We met for coffee the following week, and she looked through the photographs from the ceremony and stopped at the one of me standing beside Eleanor Gibbs with the old woman holding my hand. Sophie said, "You look surprised in this one." I said, "Because I was..." She said, "Why?" "You earned it." I thought about how to answer that. I said, "It's not that I thought I didn't deserve it. It's that when you're inside the work, you never see the whole picture. You only ever see the next piece, and then you move on. And you don't know what shape you've been making until someone shows you from the outside." Sophie nodded slowly. Then she said, "You were always doing the right thing. The proof was just somewhere else." I looked at her. That was the truest sentence anyone had said to me in a very long time. I still do this work. My back still aches on the mornings after long deployments. I still drink too much coffee. I still arrive at places slightly early because 10 years of work where timing matters has made it impossible for me to be anything else. I still print paper maps because screens fail in rain and paper doesn't. Some habits don't change because they don't need to. My mother calls more often now, not to ask about savings or plans or when I'm going to make different choices. Sometimes she calls to ask where I am, and I tell her, and she listens. Sometimes she just says, "Be careful." In Helena Spencer's language, "be careful" carries a great deal more than those two words can technically hold. Diana texted me about a week after that Friday night. She said, "Can you tell me more about the work sometime? I want to understand it better." I told her. She asked questions. We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we had managed in years. Caroline and Marcus gave me a new field pack for my birthday the following month. Inside it was a card in Caroline's handwriting that said, "For the next ones, nothing else." It didn't need anything else. The 317 letters are still here. I didn't open all of them that night in my mother's living room. I opened them gradually in the weeks after, a few at a time, reading them the way they deserved to be read, slowly and without interruption. Each one was a person. Each person was a version of a moment from those 37 hours that I had experienced from one side without knowing what it had looked like from the other. I don't remember everyone by name. That's not how my memory works. But I remember details. Eleanor Gibbs in her coat, Lan asleep on the mattress with her rabbit, the red capital letters from Class 3B, the 4 careful pages from Robert Cahill, the dog named Biscuit, and the woman who wrote that "kindness is the thing you remember longest." Tommy sitting down on the wet pavement without a word. That is the record my memory keeps, not numbers. The small details that become proof. Proof that this work means something. Proof that there were people who needed to be found and I found them. Proof that you do not always know how much what you've done has mattered until a town sends 317 letters to your mother's house on a Friday night when you had just been asked to admit that none of it had added up to anything. I never admitted that. Not because I was stubborn, because it wasn't true. There are forms of value that don't translate into the language most people use to measure a life. There are contributions that no salary can adequately represent. And in the space between the unmeasurable and what the world has learned to recognize, that is where people like me do this work every day. Not because no one notices, but because sometimes the noticing comes later, in a different form, in a child asking, "Are you Miss?" Lily on a cold morning in March, in an old woman's hand, holding yours through a ceremony, in your mother's voice, saying, "I should have said this a long time ago." You don't always get to see what you've built while you're still building it. Sometimes the proof arrives in 9 canvas bags on a Friday night, and it turns out that was always enough.